Recreation Grants Manager for the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. So where we are in the RTP timeline is we're in the full application phase. So if you're here on the webinar today, it's because you've been invited to move forward to submit the full application. And that's due January 31st. And so what we're going to be talking about today are some things you should know about managing an RTP grant. Then we're going to dig into tips and tricks specifically related to completing the application forms, share some additional resources, and then at the very end, we'll have time for live question and answers. And so why are we covering all of this content? The whole purpose of this webinar is to help you be able to build a stronger application. And that includes being able to update your plans to better understand the needs and the requirements of the program so you're ready and prepared for it. So one of the questions we've already been getting out the gate is, what can I change between the pre-application phase and the full application phase? And the answer is almost everything, other than having the project substantively be the same. So things that we allow you to change between the pre-application and the full application include any changes to budget, from updated numbers, additional costs, additional planning pieces that you're looping in, up to that max request of $50,000 for non-motorized projects. The match requirements still apply, but you can change your budget. You can change the budget allocations all you want. You can change your work plan, the steps, who's involved, when things are happening, any additions and subtractions of scope, all of that can be changed. And if we've given you any feedback along the way, we encourage you to change your plans based on those feedback. Things that you cannot change between the pre-application and the full application phase generally include really large-scale project changes, like changing project sites. Like your project should be in the same place, probably roughly the same place it was in the pre-application. If you're saying, well, we thought we were going to take our trail here and now we're taking our trail here, but it's the same parcel, that's okay. You know, especially if you're changing it for a very specific and intentional reason, like to get out of a floodplain. You know, if you can make those changes, like that's fine, but you can't say, well, we were going to do it in Park A and now we're going to move the project all the way across town to Park B. That's not the kind of change you would be allowed to make without talking to our grants team first. And the same thing with major scope changes. If you were going to be building a staircase, doing water bar work, trail maintenance, and now all of a sudden you want to build a huge 50-foot bridge, you should talk to us first if that wasn't in your pre-application, just because it should substantively be the same project. And some of those changes to work plan and budget, we encourage you to think about what you're going to need to do, not just to implement the work, but to manage an RTP grant. And so there's sort of three categories of things we're going to dig into with this: purchasing and financing, reporting requirements, and then the compliance pieces to know about. And so the state does have very specific purchasing requirements for grants. We have state and federal requirements in play, and all of these get spelled out in grant agreements. But we have sort of two resources that you can check out at this point to learn more about them. We have a sample RTP grant agreement, and I think the link's going to come to you all in the chat, but we'll also send all of these files and links out later. The sample grant agreement, and then we have a separate procurement guidance just for grantees. And basically the gist of this is that when you do large scale bidding for contracts or anything like that, that you want to have processes that are open, fair, encourage ample opportunity for people to engage, and those sorts of pieces. And so for RTP in particular, for contracts, you do need to get 3 written estimates for a contract that you're keeping on file. So you're trying to get those 3 bids as best you can. And if you're not picking the lowest one, just be sure that you are clear with your criteria and you have those in record to be able to point to say, well, why didn't you pick the lowest cost one? But you should be able to have those on file just to be able to have that information. That's not something you end up having to provide to FPR, but it is something you should have on record in case we ask. And an important thing to know about that purchasing piece is we know folks are eager as you're starting to plan, thinking about that summer ahead. folks are eager to get started, but for standard RTP projects, you have to wait. You cannot sign any contracts prior to grant agreement execution. Oftentimes, if you do, it makes those costs ineligible for reimbursement. And so you have to wait to sign contracts for this. If you're a current VOREC grantee, I know there's a few folks who have VOREC grants that are going right now who are coming to RTP for additional funds. I think I've spoken with just about everybody, but just in case I miss somebody along the way, you want to make sure that if you have a contract with a current contractor for your VOREC work, it doesn't include the RTP scope. That's allowed to be amended into a current contract if you've already been through that open bidding process, but it has to wait until after the grant agreement is signed before the contract can be executed for the RTP work. And that's a federal requirement. So that's just a piece of like, it's an ineligible cost at that point. So it's just something to note is that you have to wait till you get a signed grant agreement to sign any contracts. Once you've made your purchases, one of the questions we often get about managing grants is the reimbursement process. And so all RTP grants are reimbursement grants. That means that if you're selected to be a grantee, you have to spend the money first, and then you'll submit a request to FPR to get reimbursed for those costs. And you really should be paying that. You're going to get an invoice, you pay the invoice, and then you submit your request to FPR for reimbursement. And that reimbursement process, just because some folks know, well, how does that work? What is the timing for cash flow planning purposes for the size of your project? Generally, we say that if it's a regular standing thing, you can apply for reimbursement as frequently as every 3 months. So that is as frequently as every 3 months. It can be longer than 3 months. You can go on a 6-month cycle, it's fine. So we have some grantees, depending on the size of their project, who even just wait to the end of their projects to submit for reimbursement. All of those are okay. It just can't be a reimbursement that's happening more frequently than 3 months, unless there's really a special extenuating circumstance, in which case then you'd reach out to FPR, ask for that exemption, and we would review it on a case-by-case basis. But just to give you an example of like common ones that have come up in the past, some people have said, well, it's the year end for us. It's year end. Can we just get reimbursed at this point, even though we submitted a reimbursement a month ago? Generally, that's not the time when we'd say yes. Just because the timing of the calendar year, there's a lot of work that goes into reimbursements. So generally, that's not something that we would say yes for an exemption for. But we've had other groups, let's all hope this doesn't happen next year, but we had grantees that were impacted by floods. And so they had just made expenses on an RTP project, then the floods hit. And even though they had already submitted for a reimbursement before, we waived that 3-month requirement because they needed the cash as quickly as they could to help rebuild their communities. So that would be an example of like an extreme extenuating circumstance. Most of the time, they're hopefully not going to be happening for that for you. But huge one-time purchases or something like that would be something we've discussed. But generally, we recommend that grantees plan to be reimbursed about every 3 months at the most frequent. And we share that for cash flow purposes. So you can think about like, well, when are expenses occurring? When, how big of a grant should we go for? Are we going to need to plan for other types of expenses, say a loan or something to cover costs in between the reimbursement periods? It's something we want to tell you now so you can already start planning for it. And with those reimbursements, once you've gotten to that frequency, there are documents that you need to provide, which is part of the period between it, is we know that there's a lift. So every time that you'd file for reimbursement, and we'll give you, if you're selected for a grant, all of this information again in much greater detail later on. But things in general that you need will be an invoice to FPR for the amount of your expenses, documentation of all the expenses in the match related to the project, and a progress report. So that is something you have to submit every single time you submit a reimbursement, is all of that information. And when once it's submitted to the grants team, generally you can expect to be reimbursed 4 to 6 weeks from that date that you've submitted it to us. It can be a little bit longer if there ends up being an amendment needed before we can process a reimbursement. It can also be potentially sped up a little bit if you set up ACH payments with the state. But in general, we recommend folks, again, thinking for those cash flow planning purposes, to be anticipating 4 to 6 weeks from when a reimbursement is submitted to us to when you get the check in the mail. And so I mentioned those financial documentations for expenses and match. And just to kind of cover what those are, it's really the whole host and gamut to explain what the costs are. So these are things like copies of invoice, if we're talking about contracts, that'd be invoices. If it's staff time, we're talking labor reports or timesheets. If it's volunteer time, it's a log of volunteer hours, or some other federally accepted timekeeping records. If it is a purchase, it could be a receipt, an itemized receipt. If it is a donation, we got to have a donation documentation if it's an in-kind donation there. And generally that has to be signed by the donor as a piece. And that's part of the federal requirements for expense documentation. The other piece with documentation, I know that across the pre-applications, there were several submissions for equipment. And how we define equipment purchases at the state is it's a single item that is not permanently fixed in place that is going to be over $5,000 in value. So like a trailer would be an example. And if your project has equipment that is a part of this project, that's part of the documentation pieces that and the requirements of the state, that this equipment can forever only be used for the grant purposes, even after the end date of the grant. And so if the trailer purchase is written to say do trail maintenance, as long as you're keeping a log that shows that the trailer has only and forever been used for trail maintenance, if we ever ask, you'll be set. But if you ever anticipate using it for something else, know that there's going to be really extensive record keeping that has to be able to show what that is, because then we're talking about like split costs, and it's super, super complicated with the records. So if you are doing equipment and you are trying to think about how this is going to work, please feel free to reach out to our team, and we will walk you through this on a case-by-case example with your specific equipment requests. But know that if you're doing equipment, it's not just the purchase price, but it's also the usage log that you're going to have to be tracking. There's also some different financial pieces for staff and contractors. It's something we get a lot because they're both eligible for RTP, but the documentation is different. And we have an established document. It's the RTP Grant Administration Guidance. This is the version that we put out for the grantees from last year. The version for this year will look suspiciously similar, but with updated dates. That's really the biggest piece of, like, we're calling out the dates for different reimbursement eligibility. So if you're debating, like, well, do we do staff? Do we do contractors? I encourage you to look at that document to figure out that documentation requirement. The other piece I want to call out with staff and contractors is that both of these costs are allowed either for reimbursement or match, and that includes project administration. I think that's something that's really valuable about RTP. It's a really great opportunity, is that it takes work to do it, but RTP will help cover that time if you put it into the grant, or it can be used as part of your matching expenses. So just to think about this as you're thinking about, okay, well, I'm going to have to put these reimbursements together, I'm going to have to do all these other pieces, like, think about potentially including that in there if it's within your budget, within the total eligible amounts. Because the other major piece that's part of kind of the pieces that you'll have to work with us on is reporting. So I mentioned that progress reports are due with each reimbursement. And we have a really fairly quick one-page, it's like one tab in an Excel document now, that is for our progress reporting. And so if you are doing reimbursements every 3 months, that means you're going to give us a progress report every 3 months. Every time you submit a reimbursement, we get a progress report. If you're not submitting for reimbursements that quickly, if it's a more extended time, we'll expect annual reports from every grantee. So if it's been more than a year, then we've heard from you. We'll be reaching out to say, hey, we'd like to have a progress report. And so it's a one-page template. It's a high level, what have you accomplished? What's come up? Are you on schedule? Those sorts of pieces. And then at the very end, Marlene has just dropped the link to the progress report in the chat. At the very end, we have a final report, which is the same progress report template, and another tab that's the final report addendum. It's both pieces for the final report. And then you'll also have to give us any pieces that we specify in the grant agreement. And usually those include things like documentation of the physical deliverables. So a common example that we write into construction projects is we ask for pre, during, and post construction pictures, basically to say, yes, we did this, it happened, it's here. And then we can see from the pictures that, like, yes, there was no stone staircase and now there is a stone staircase. We can see those differences. And so generally photos are a piece that we require from that. So just to keep that in mind before you start work is that we do ask for before work photos in general. And then if your project includes any sort of digital deliverables, like you're making a map, you're doing signage design before it's going to be installed, things like that, we'll ask for PDFs or links to those as part of your digital deliverables at the very end. And so that's the reporting. Overall, we try to keep it pretty light. As I said, it's annual. If we don't hear from you, and otherwise it's once at the end or with every reimbursement, just depends on your choice. But beyond reporting and the purchasing, the other kind of thing to know about managing an RTP grant are the compliance requirements. And those are fiscal, environmental, accessibility related, and historical preservation. And I'm going to walk through each of these and what it means for you as potential grantees. And so the first is our state fiscal compliance piece. And so for every grantee that is selected to move forward, the way our review processes work is that if you're selected, really the next piece that we move into is our compliance checks, where we are moving through a lot of these fiscal compliance pieces. And these are documents that are required by the state for every single grant. And one is an Act 54 certificate of good standing. It's just basically a statement that says we're in good standing with the state. So it's not a nonprofit piece. It's a specific form that we give you that you fill out. We have a financial risk assessment that our business office requires. We require certificates of insurance, naming the state of Vermont as an additional insured, and we require a W-9. And all of these things are outlined in the full application guidance under, I think it's section 5 there in the back. We have links to all the original documents and the details. You do not have to submit these documents with your application. Please don't, actually. We really encourage you not to submit these things with the application. But there will be a button, it's a question in the full application that says, will you be able to comply with them? And you'll say yes or no. And so in order to fairly think about that piece, you should review that information in advance. So it is there, it is linked in the full application guidance. We also have environmental compliance. And this includes things like NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. Sorry, there's a typo there. The National Environmental NEPA. And most RTP projects qualify for a NEPA exclusion if they categorical exclusion that we have, but we'll do the paperwork behind the scenes with that. But as part of that kind of whole package that we're putting together, there's also a state level piece of the state environmental permits. So with the pre-application, we asked for the permit navigator or project review sheet. Both of these tools list the potential permits you need, but all grantees from FPR are required to ultimately go and get the permits that are required for them. So you have to follow through on securing them or identifying whether or not those permits are needed. That's just a requirement for environmental compliance, is that you have to get permits for your work. We'll also be working behind the scenes to help check to make sure that all of our projects are going to clear the Endangered Species Act, which in Vermont, usually the major impact is potentially for the northern long-eared bat and involves tree cutting during the summer. So there's a series of questions in the application that help to dig in. So like, are you cutting trees over 3 inches in diameter? And if so, can you do it in the wintertime? Because if you can do it in the wintertime, that generally helps to prevent negative impacts on the northern long-eared bat, because they might be using trees as roost trees during the summer. in the winter, they tend to hibernate in caves. So the tree cutting is just not as much of an issue for them at that point. But if you're doing that, we will be checking on that, and we'll be working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to make sure that we get letters for every single project that's there. And FPR does a lot of that work, but there's more information about it in the application guidance. For the accessibility requirement, this is a federal requirement that all like new trail and like new trail construction projects are required to be accessible at the federal level. But there are a series of exemptions for trails where that requirement could cause substantial harm to cultural, historic, religious, or significant natural features or characteristics. If that accessibility requirement would substantially alter the nature of the setting or the purpose of the trail. If it would require construction methods or materials that are prohibited by state, federal, or local regulations or statutes, or if it's not feasible due to the terrain or the prevailing construction practices. And so if your project meets one of these exceptions, it doesn't have to be fully accessible. Like if you can be able to say, yes, this is how my project meets an exception, it does not have to be fully exceptional, but you will have to explain that in the full application of how that connects. Because if you're saying, well, we're building a parking lot, but it's not going to be an accessible parking lot, that's at the point where you're really probably going to say, interesting. How can you make that case? Because if the case isn't there, if we can't be able, if our review committees and staff teams can't say, yes, that's it, the piece, it's not going to be allowed to move forward just because from federal requirements, we can't be able to fund it with federal dollars. So if you have any questions about this requirement, please feel free to reach out. But RTP has a history of funding trails in the past where, it's a historic trail that goes over the crest of the mountain. We funded it work, not necessarily through RTP, but from other trail programs like the Burroughs Trail that goes at the side of Campbell somewhere. It like goes up to a rock face. There is no way to make that just based on the terrain and the nature of the trail and the historic nature that would be one that could qualify for an exemption. So just to think about those pieces as you're developing your plans, just to make sure that you feel like you can make that case. And then the last piece in terms of the client compliance review is the National Historic Preservation Act, also known as Section 106. And this is a piece that all RTP projects have to comply with as federal funding. And it is a really specific piece that's trying to understand whether or not the project is going to have any effect on a location that could be potentially included in the National Register of Historic Places. And so things that commonly get put on the National Register of Historic Places are places that have an association with events that have been significant in history. They're correlated to important people in history. They have really distinctive architectural characteristics that are, representative of their time and are very special. Or that this is a site that has data that could tell us information that we don't otherwise have. And so that's the types of things that we're looking for. So it could be indigenous settlements, it could be historic colonial structures, it could be a whole host of different archaeological resources and historical resources. And so the way this process works, every project that is selected for RTP goes through a review process. And with this, the whole point in this process is to flag things that need consultation and accommodation. It is not to stop projects, but really to manage the impact potentially that they're going to have on the historic resource. And so really the whole piece is to, according to the federal legislation, the goal is to accommodate those historic preservation concerns with the needs of federal undertakings through consultation among agency officials and other parties. The goal of the consultation is to identify historic properties potentially affected by the undertaking, assess the effects, and seek ways to avoid, minimize, or mitigate any adverse effects on historical properties. And so if you're saying, okay, that's great, how does that actually work? How it works is that when projects are selected for RTP, we as a staff at FPR will generally develop write-ups and summaries of the projects with all the information that's needed. And we submit that information to our state historic preservation officers to review that project. And sometimes just right out of the gate, they'll say, those state historic preservation officers will either ask for more information to know more. They'll say, yes, this project doesn't seem like it's going to have any effect, or they might request that grantees hire a consultant. And for that consultant, the most common piece that's used for RTP projects is often the requirement for an ARA, an archaeological resource assessment. And that's basically needed when our information that we have, like, we can't tell whether or not, just from paper, whether or not this project might impact a historical resource. We don't know what's there. And so with this, that might be required, or the other piece that's occasionally required, especially if you're working on a historic structure, might be an architectural historian. And so if that is required, it's then the responsibility of a grantee to hire a consultant to do those pieces. Those are eligible costs for RTP, but the consultant needs to do the work. That information then goes back to the State Historic Preservation Office, where they then generally get to either a piece where they're going to be submitting a letter of concurrence to say they're signing off to say it'll have no effect, or it has the minimal potential for effect. Or depending on what it is, it could move forward to additional phases of archaeological assessment. And so most of the time with RTP projects, generally where we see these needs come in is just based on the type of work, but not everybody needs to plan for an ARA. And so we developed this chart to kind of help you think through this of like, should you plan for an ARA in your work plan and budget? Because this is an RTP eligible expense. So we might require it, but then we can also help pay for it if it's in your budget. But not everybody needs it. So if your project is not construction related, it is programming, it is buying the equipment trailer, and that's all you're doing. It's land acquisition. It is not construction. You don't generally need to plan for an ARA. If your project is maintenance that is 100% within the existing previously disturbed footprint, generally you don't need an ARA. On the other end of the spectrum, like if you're planning to build new things, like new trail systems, new trail amenities, like new parking lots, a big bathroom building, a new pavilion, we recommend that you put an ARA into your work plan and budget just to be safe so that you have that planned money available. If it turns out that you're not required to do it, we generally work with grantees to then say, okay, you didn't need it. How else could this money support your project? You get to submit an updated budget to us. We're not taking money generally away immediately. But if you go the other way and it's not in your budget, we generally award every single penny that we have available each year. We don't have more money to give. And so you have to think about, as a grantee, either what are you taking out of your grant or finding other money to cover that required expense, because nothing can move forward until the compliance is complete with the, if that's required. So we can't add money to your grant. So if you're doing that new construction, we recommend that you err on the side of including it in. Same time, if you're doing any work on unknown historic site, go ahead and just plan for it. Just like have the money there so you're ready for it. Things that are a little bit more in the gray area, it just depends on like the location and the scale. Like, are you doing a significant trail reroute? Maybe you might want to plan and put that in just so it's in your budget. So you have that money potentially available. But again, it depends on the location and scale. If you're rerouting like 5 feet, I might not put that in, but if you're doing 150-foot reroute, or we've had ones that are more like 300-foot or 1,000-foot reroutes in the past. Like that's basically new trail construction at this point. So you should probably err on the side of putting it in. The same way, if you're doing like a total tear down and replacement of existing assets, you're completely ripping out an old bridge and putting in a new one. It just depends on the bridge and the other pieces of like, should you put that in? So it depends on the location and the scale. And again, like the other kind of piece of like that kind of maybe section is smaller to medium sized trail amenities. Think about it based on your location and the scale. Things like you're going to put in a new kiosk, you're going to put in a privy somewhere. Just to think about that of like whether you need it or not, you can put that in. But it's something we recommend for the planning pieces before you move forward, because the next piece is really the application, right? Like that's what I think a lot of people came here today for, is like, I'm ready to work on my application. What do I do? And so we're going to run through the different components and some tips and tricks on each of those. So all the application materials will be submitted through an online form called A&R Online. And you should have been sent a link to that form when you were notified about moving forward. We'll probably be sending it out again and again. Probably even to this email, we'll send it to you. But that is going to be the place where you submit the application. You do not email us any submitted materials. Everything goes in online. But that online form is not the best for like team editing, because it really is an online form. You can save your content, you can come back to it, but you can't really have multiple people working on it at the same time. And it also is not always the easiest for copying and pasting. And so because of that, we have provided everybody with our Microsoft Word, we call it the preview version of the online form questions. It's all the same questions. It's just in a Word document version. And that's so that you can draft, you can, if you have multiple people working on it, you can share your document around, you can do all those things, and then you'll just copy it into the online form at the end. Some things to know about the online form is that we have numbered the questions in the Word version. And this is because the online form is it has responsive question logic, right? So if you say yes to this question, it will give you these questions. And if you say no, it will take you there. That's really hard to communicate in a Word document. So we have put that in with numbered questions. So if you say yes to question number 47, you go to question 48. If you say no, you go to question 52. So the numbers are in there to help you reference it. But when you go to copy and paste, just look for the question text that's there. So don't just go looking for question 42 because you won't find it. But the text will be there for you. The other piece that's sort of a tip and trick is that if you have an acquisition that is a part of your project, we really do recommend for those that you specifically look at the online version first, because the question response logic is quite complex. And so just if you're like, I'm trying to follow the Word version, I'm not seeing it, like go ahead and check the online version first, just so that you don't draft lots of questions or lots of responses for information you do not need, just because there's only certain fields that you'll have to answer. So that's kind of the general piece for drafting. All the contents in there to be able to tell your story, to be able to put in the questions for the narrative side are all through there. But one of the core pieces that is part of this question or this application is that you will be prompted to enter a UEI, a unique entity identifier. This is a number that is assigned to your organization from the federal government. If you do not have one yet, we recommend you start immediately at sam.gov to get that. Hopefully you have one already. Generally, they take a while to get. If you start now, there is a chance, just depending on what the pacing of the federal government, it might not come through in time. So it is something you will need for the full application. And if you don't have one, this might be the chance to like start reaching out to somebody to be like, could they be your fiscal sponsor? And they could actually be the lead applicant to help support that and share their, use their UEI for that. But a UEI is required for the full application. The other piece of the application form asks are some contact information. And this has historically been a little bit confusing of who's who in these pieces. And so we asked for contact information for two different people. The first is the project contact. This is the person that we're going to reach out to if we have questions about the work. And ideally, they're going to be somebody who answers email to be able to answer questions from us. This could be the person who is at the applicant organization. It could be, like if a town is applying, it could be the town manager. It could, if they're involved, it could be the project manager. It could also be the really key volunteer on the committee who doesn't work for the town, but is supporting the project, but it still knows everything that's going on. And they're probably going to be the person doing all the reporting. It doesn't have to be that an employee of the applying entity, but it should be somebody who knows what's happening and is going to be often the person who's like helping with reporting or making sure, checking stuff against the scope of work. They're familiar with the project. It does not have to be the person who is in the field doing the work. This is not where you need to tell us that person. Because it could be, as I said, the town manager, but then like there's other town staff doing the work, or we often will work with like grant managers, or if you have a development manager or a volunteer project manager who might not be doing the work because they're working with a contractor, right? Like that's the kind of people we're looking for the project contact, is the person who knows what's going on, so that when we have questions and we say, hey, how's it going, they can share an update. And that's the piece. The authorized representative is the other contact we're asking for. And that is the person who is affiliated with the applying entity, who has the authority to sign legal and financial documents on the behalf of the organization. This is the person who can sign the grant agreement. That's basically who this is the person who can sign it. Sometimes they're the same person for the project contact and the authorized representative, but not always. Some examples of authorized representatives could be like a select board chair, an executive director, a financial manager. It is up to your entity who has been empowered with that authority to sign those legal documents. And for all of the things that we're covering, all of this and more is in the full application guidance, with all kinds of helpful examples, information, and other tips. And we have often, I just want to highlight that we've put those many times in call out boxes. So like if there's an application tip, like we have things throughout this whole document of like recommended nomenclature for naming files. And part of the reason we have this is because you'll put everything into that online form, but when we go pull it out of the online form, it basically spits out a giant file folder of all the files loose together. They're all just like all in one folder is how it comes to the review committee. And so if the review committee is going, work plan, yes, budget, yes, they can find your documents if you follow the nomenclature that we have. But like, that's the point of it. So like, if you're like, I used an underscore, not a dash, like, do not panic. That's not what it's about. It's about trying to help you find it. But like the tip is there in the application guidance to help you understand the why that we're asking for some of this information. The same thing, we get the question of like, can I resubmit the same stuff that I gave you in the pre-app? And the answer is generally yes, so long as nothing has changed. That's fine. You're also allowed, if your project didn't have feedback, if you're not having an overhaul, you don't have to do substantive changes. Like if your permit navigator report is the same, great. You can resubmit it. You didn't change your project. You just have to resubmit it in the full application. So watch out for those call out boxes throughout the document. Speaking of work plans, that's sort of like one of the main uploads with this. And as we were reviewing the pre-applications, we saw a couple things that we just wanted to highlight for everybody. The first was just to like pause and reflect and make sure that as you're looking through your work plan, that all the steps are included. We did have a couple proposals where we're like, what are you going to do? Build the trails. Like we need you to distill it a little bit more for us than just a one-step process, because we know it takes more than one step to do those pieces. So make sure you're trying to distill those steps down and to do your best to make sure all the columns are filled out. We did see work plans that like don't have start and end dates or didn't have anticipated results or other pieces. And so just check your work plan and make sure that all that information is there, because it's there generally because the ranking committees in the past have asked about it. It's an important piece for them to know. So it's to your advantage to make sure it's filled out. And with your work plans, there are the piece of like, well, what do we put in that top set of boxes about the RTP work and what it goes into the complementary work? And so if you are using RTP dollars or RTP match, that's the RTP work. If this is like work that's happening beforehand that is not being covered by RTP dollars, it should go in complementary work. If it is ultimate work that you're like, it's the phase 2 that we want you to tell about, it's not in this grant, put it in the other section to just make it really clear what is the RTP work and what is the other work that's supporting this project outside of RTP. So just make sure you split those up. The other piece with work plans that we saw is there was just some pieces about timeline, I should say. And so just to refresh that, you know, we're in this full application period. We're going to be reviewing applications February and March. Then between April and July, we're working on grant agreements. We really do say that really projects should not start for standard RTP until estimate like as a start date July 14th, 2025. So if we're seeing stuff in the work plan that's like, we're going to start this in April, chances are, like that'll be something that raises some questions unless it's one of those like eligible pre-award expenses that we have said that you're using as match only. But on the whole, you want to make sure all your work is within that eligible project period from July 14th, 2025 through December 31st of 26 is how we are. Because anything that happens that's construction related that happens before the federal highway authorization just won't be eligible. So it's better to just push your whole timeline back until after that start date, because there's that. And then we get into the ARA period. And if you need one, we'll let you know. We'll be in touch. But you've got to wait for the other pieces. The last work plan component that has come up in the past is the anticipated results. And so with the anticipated results, just to clarify those a bit more, these are the measurables that are going to go into the grant agreements eventually to say, like, what are you going to accomplish? So we know that you were a success. And if you're not sure, you can say at least, up to, and you don't have to have them for every line depending on how you do it, but you should have some sort of result for every major activity. Like you're putting in a bridge. How big is the bridge? Like those are the types of information. We're going to maintain the trail. How many feet or how many miles a trail are you going to maintain? Like try to give us like a defined amount within that anticipated result. Like that's what we're looking for so that we can just use that as a measure of success. There were also questions about construction with this of like people going, well, what do I put in? What do I don't put in? And so we did put this in as related to the pre-application guidance. It was one of the updates we made partway through because the question was coming up. But if your project is basically trail maintenance or construction, repair, anything like that, if you're building on a physical asset or resource, signs, trails, trail amenities, you're doing any kind of maintenance, replacement, installation, we're probably going to consider it construction. If you are digging, cutting down trees, ditching, removing plants, applying chemicals, we're going to consider it construction. If you are permanently installing anything like a sign, we're going to consider it construction for the sake of our guidance. If it's not construction, it might be exclusively education or programming, could be a land acquisition, only an equipment, or only snow grooming. But if your project contains any of those construction elements, you're going to need to make sure you get your permits in place for that, that those are there, and that you fill out all the application materials that say for construction. If you have a non-construction project, check the guidance. We've said in the guidance, like, okay, well, there's a mandatory map upload. What do you put in the map section if you're not construction? We've spelled that all out for you. And if it, with construction projects in particular, they are going to be carefully reviewed for resilience. So just to be sure to call out any factors that contribute to making your project more resilient in your application as applied. So if you're saying, yeah, we did a bridge, like, okay, did somebody look at it? How do you know what the bridge is? Are you doing materials specifically for a plan? Like say that so the review committee knows. So just to be sure to call that out. Maps are required for the full application. They're required for all construction projects and all place-based non-construction projects. We new for this year have updated the map checklist. So even if you've done an RTP grant before, we encourage you to review the current map checklist. We've actually taken out some things from that checklist that we realized we don't need to have. So we've taken it out for you. And if you have mapping software that you use that can get you everything on the map checklist, great. Please use what you know and you're comfortable with. If you do not have mapping software that you already have access to, there is a free tool online. It's called A&R Atlas, and we have step-by-step instructions and an instructional video for how to build a map in this online form that meets all of our requirements. The budget was the other piece you already submitted once, and really the biggest piece to call out about the budget that we saw from the pre-application review is that overall the description was pretty light on them in terms of how you got those numbers. And so we just encourage folks to really include that information in your budget. Like if you're saying it's $10,000 to do this contractor, like where did you get that number? Was that based on quotes from somebody? Was that based on like an hour calculation of the, this many dollars an hour times this many hours? Like where did those numbers come from? So that's an important piece to call out, just because we saw that in the pre-application that a lot of budgets didn't quite have that information. So it's something to pay attention to. And I'm gonna cruise through the next one real fast as I see we're coming up on time here. But with the match, most projects were pretty fine. There were a few that were quite under the 20% match just because it was how it was calculated. The math was not quite mathing up for everybody. They were taking the 20% out of the request, not the project total. So just make sure that your 20% is there to be able to have that match can be cash or in kind. And you do have that pre-award planning period for planning and permitting costs only. That's roughly starts January of 24. You all filled it out already in the first budget of like getting your match in the budget formula, but in the full application, there's a narrative question, which is where you're going to tell us who the match is coming from and the general source of the match and the status of the match. Is it a grant from a private funder and you've already gotten the grant? That funding is committed. Or is it a grant from a private funder you've applied for? Is it going to be in your budget and the budget has been approved already by the select board? These are the types of information that we're looking for in the full application, is who's giving it and the status of that match. And we have detailed information in the application guidance to help you explain that. For permitting, we went over this a lot for the pre-application phase, but all construction projects do need to submit a permit navigator report or a project review sheet, even if you're working on your own land. Really, the main exception is for projects on state or federal lands. And we encourage you to check out the pre-application guidance for those steps if you need it. But something to call is just to remember that those permit reports really just flag what you need, and it is your responsibility to follow up on those. And there's actually even a spot in the full application for you to say and report to the review committee your permit progress to date. So there's a spot where you said, I called the permit specialist identified. They said I didn't need it. You can tell us that in the application. But if you don't say that, and they'll say, well, the permit navigator report said that they would need these 3 permits, but the permits aren't in their work plan and budget, like what's happening there? There's going to be some questions raised. So even if you have confirmed that it's not needed, it's good to put that in that question in the application. And again, you have to wait for a grant agreement if you're going to be using grant funds to cover permitting costs. And make sure those are included in your work plan and budget. They can be expensive. So if you think you're going to need one, the other advantage of going forward with that now is you can get those in your budget and that you can get them into your work plan. Specifically with RTP, we recommend that the first summer field season is for planning and permitting final contracting pieces together. And then the second field season is for construction. Landowner permission. We're getting there. We're getting there. I know there's a lot of pieces here with this, but landowner permission is required for the full application. And landowner permission is really twofold. It is like whose name is on the paperwork, who owns the deed, right? Like who is the landowner? And we do have landowner permission forms required to this, but there are also landowner permission impacts that can be more subtle than that. Things like encumbrances. And so we recommend that all RTP applicants check for things like easements or deed restrictions or right-of-way that might impact your project as part of that. And there's a question in the application that asks for that. If you don't own your land in full, like there is that other landowner, we do require signed landowner permission for all of the landowners where the work is not happening. And that is a core required document. To make that easy, we have a form that is the private landowner permission form that you use for private landowners. You can also use it for nonprofit landowners or local towns. If you're working for state and federal lands, generally they can just send a letter because their properties are already open to the public that just gives permission for the work. And we do have some other forms for other specialty circumstances. If you're doing work on a class 4 road, we have a specialty class 4 road permission form. If you're a nonprofit, one of the common relationships we see is a nonprofit that has an MOU with a town to maintain an area. If that MOU covers 100% of the work in your scope of work, we'll accept that MOU as that proof of land ownership. The biggest thing to watch for, though, is that 100%, because we've seen lots of MOUs in the past where like there's an MOU to maintain the property, but that MOU doesn't cover new construction. It doesn't cover replacements. So if you have an MOU, just read it carefully to make sure that those match with your scope. We do also allow private forms to come through. If you have your own custom landowner permission form, it has to have a start and an end date. It has to have time windows that meet or exceed the RTP requirements. It has to both give permission to the grantee to do the work, and it has to give permission for the land to be open to the public, or the resource to be open to the public. And it has to be signed and dated. Our don'ts for landowner permission form is that if you're doing a large permanent asset that's on somebody else's land, so think like huge bridges, permanent restroom structures, like those generally require easements, which are their own separate legal documentation. None of FPR's easy forms satisfy that requirement. And the other piece to check in is like, even if you have permission that's sort of a blanket permission in the past, it doesn't necessarily mean permission for this project. So we always encourage applicants to reach out to their landowners just to confirm that the landowners are aware and approve of that specific project. The climate resilience risk form is another part of the full application. We encourage folks, especially if you have complex project, we told many folks this already, if it applied to you, you can consider submitting more than one to the full application for this if it's just hard to capture it. But one of the things that we did see in the forms that we got is there was a mismatch between the climate resilience form and the work plan. We'd say the work plan saying, I'm building a bridge, but the climate resilience risk form says there's no river crossings and no wetlands. And that is confusing. You're building a bridge, but this isn't there. So make sure that those things match your final work plan, the answers to the climate resilience risk form, because otherwise that ends up raising more questions than it does to really help explain and understand the importance of your project. We did send out feedback as well. So if we told you to do something, whether that was design related or putting into the application, we strongly encourage you. We encourage you to really think deeply on that. And then I've got two more pieces with the application. The one is just something new for this year, is that we have two different types of letters that can be submitted. They don't have to both be submitted, but they can be submitted. One does have to be submitted, and that's the letters of support. Minimum of one that is required, maximum of 3. And the whole point is like, this is showing the community need for your project. Why is it important that other people are behind this statement? We also have an upload field for a letter of commitment, which is entirely different. This is saying, if my organization is working with my partner organization and we're applying, it's a letter from my partner to say, yes, we were asked and we agreed to participate. That is really what it is. It's just a letter of like, confirmed, we're in. And so if you are working with external partners, we just encourage you to get those. But if you are doing the work all by yourselves, if you're going to be contracting out the work, there is no need to submit a letter of commitment. It is only for those collaborative projects. The last section of the application is the supplemental information. And for this one, as I mentioned earlier, with the way the form puts all the files together into a single folder for us on the back end, we just recommend that you use descriptive file names in this. So like, it's the photos file, so we can see it and go, oh, okay, that's what it is, versus like it's IQS4 exclamation underscore whatever the scanner gave you. When it's that, nobody knows what it is, and chances are that file is going to be lost. But if you say this is the budget estimates file, it's going to be a lot easier for us to figure out what that is. Similarly, we recommend that you condense like documents into one file if you can, just so that we're like, okay, we're going to pull up all the budget estimates together, so that way they can be reviewed, versus like we've had proposals in the past that come in and you're like, here's our 27 different financial documents to back up our budget. And that's really hard to find them and to go through them all. So if you can combine, we strongly recommend it. We also recommend that you watch for submitting PC accessible file types. So some common ones are like a .heic file, which is actually Apple's iPhone pictures default. Those we can't open on like a Windows computer. And so the review committee probably won't be able to see it if you put it in that way. Versus if you put in a JPEG, they can probably open it. So it won't be an access type. And the final piece with supplemental information is that more is not always better. Sometimes you've given us everything you need, and just to think about being really careful with that. The one example, though, that we say that is that we do recommend, or like alternate example is for bridges. Because if you're telling us, we've had this come in the past where people are like, we're building a 50-foot bridge with RTP. Well, are you building a bridge, or a bridge? The photo can make all the difference for the ranking committee to understand what you're trying to do. So if you have a photo, whether that's just a design idea, you have architectural drawings, whatever, if you're building a bridge, we do recommend you put some sort of imagery in so people are like, that's the bridge they're going for, and they can understand. So that was a lot. The application is a lift. I understand. We really do have a lot of pieces within this, but every single piece I've covered is going to be considered. And it goes into a really detailed scoring process that's looking for readiness, resilience, sustainability, public benefit, and community support. And that is reviewed by a ranking committee. We then add in some additional pieces. This is spelled out in the guidance. We give bonus points for some priorities, things like projects that are 100% maintenance or more than 50% maintenance. And we give bonus points to applicants that did not receive an RTP grant last year. So if you got one 2 years ago, you'd still get bonus points. If you're a first-time RTP applicant, you would get bonus points. But if you got a grant last year, you just don't get those bonus points. And then the last piece of the review is the geographic distribution and recreation distribution. So we look at those pieces as kind of a final layer of the review. So what's next? Review the information that we have available. We've shared a lot. Those applications are due January 31st. It's coming up quick. There are some resources available if you are looking to get external support for grant writing. All of this will be emailed to you, but Vermont League of Cities and Towns, the Municipal Technical Assistance Program, and the READY program are 3 options that are available across the state, depending if you qualify. And then we have our own additional support. So I'm going to be happy to stay on. I realize that we had a lot to talk about today. And so I'm going to stay on, answer questions. This will all be continued to be recorded if you've got to hop off. But we will also have another open hours on January 28th at 3 p.m. For you to come and ask questions live. And that one, I will have no slides prepared. It is all about you and your questions. You can also always reach us through email. And so with that, I'm going to stop. I'll stop sharing here. Thank you for bearing with us through all of these pieces. And for now, I'll go ahead and start opening it up for questions. I know they've been coming in through the chat.
Yes. Thank you, Lauren. We do have some great questions. So let's start with Cheryl. I'm going back to those financial documentation slides. Cheryl asks, when documenting an in-kind labor conducted by town personnel, what documentation is needed? Are signed timesheets required? Should we just use the established volunteer rate, or do we need to provide details on salaried employees' financial compensation packages in order to establish an hourly rate?
Thank you for asking that question, Cheryl. There is actually right above your comment in the chat is the grant administration guidance. I suggest you go there. We have a whole section on timekeeping of what we need. But the short story is no, you do not need signed timesheets. And yes, you should use salary information, but you just tell us what that information is. You should be able to back it up if we ask further, but at minimum, we need sort of a chart of information of like, who is it, how much time, what's their hourly rate, and what were they doing.
Okay.
So there's that.
That's great.
But we've got it there for you. But I suggest that other document will give you much more detail about the kind of information that you need.
Thanks, Lauren. We have another question from Becky. If you're going to contract going to a contract to get work done, do you need 3 bids? There really aren't 3 affordable organizations to do the trail.
If you're going to go to contract, generally you do need to go and get 3 bids. So that is a piece. If it is going to be a contract for work, you do need to get it, because there are actually a decent number of trail builders that are out there that if you're saying, yeah, we're going to work with a trail builder, this is who it is. There are some specialty types that sometimes, like, that procurement guidance does dig into sometimes, like, if there's a specialty work, what if it, like, you should do your best to get 3 bids. If you can't get 3 bids because, we cannot make contractors reply to bids, and this is like when you're implementing your grant, we'll work with you on that piece. But in general, you should try to get 3 bids when you're doing the project implementation.
Great. Becky also asks, do you already have federal funds at hand for this grant cycle, or are you instead anticipating federal disbursement later this year?
Yeah, so RTP has been authorized through 2026. So that was authorized back in 2022. So we're still like getting through all the steps, and that's just like the timeline of the process. But those funds have been authorized through. So we will be having a grant round this year. So
Tom asks, at what point do we learn whether or not we need to do an archaeological resource assessment?
awesome. Thank you for that. That one will be, so we recommend that you think about it now, making your best guess based on the information we've provided. Once grant applicants are selected, what we'll do is we'll submit those to the Federal Highway Administration for their authorization. And generally, while Federal Highway is sitting with it, we start to reach out to the department, like the historic specialists at the state. And so generally, by the time we get to the grant agreement development, if an ARA is required for your grant, it will go into your grant agreement. You will know that from the get-go. And if not, that like it'll be during grant agreement development that we tell you that you have the opportunity to rework your budget one way or the other. So it'll be during that grant agreement development phase that we tell folks.
Okay, jumping down to Erica's question. We have maps created with ArcGIS, but without all of the required labels. Would it be sufficient to use the existing map and just add the labels in a PDF format?
Yes.
Great.
That's a good one. Nice short one.
Okay, Alex has a question. If we are doing maintenance to existing trail corridor on state lands, does our sign a cooperative agreement and MOU in place for management and maintenance with FPR count as landowner permission, or do we need additional documentation? Part 2 of the question, if we are working with FPR on this, should we get a letter of support or a letter of commitment from FPR?
Thank you for asking those questions, Alex. With that piece, if you have an MOU in place that does cover 100% of your work, then yes, we would accept it. But honestly, like part 2 is probably your better choice, because generally we want to see that like the state land managers are aware of your project and have given permission for that project as part of that. And so it's actually listed in a couple of places in the application guidance for like the letters of support and the letters of commitment section of the guidances, or the sections of the guidance of, if your project is on state lands, these are the things you can do. In many cases, you can just get one letter from them that covers all the things you need.
Tom has a follow-up question about the ARA. What is a good figure to put in the budget in anticipation of an ARA?
That is a wonderful question, and one that I have temporarily forgotten off the top of my head. It is in the pre-application guidance in the budget section. I want to say it's like $3,000, maybe $3,500 that we recommended. Knowing that ARA costs, I was actually just running numbers with somebody today. They vary wildly based across the consultants that are available. There are consultants that do charge the lower end of the spectrum that are sometimes around $1,100 to $1,200. There are consultants that charge up to $7,000 for the work. And some of it depends on like their workload. Can you get in with your preferred consultant? What are your criteria that you're looking for? So we do have a recommended number though that we have used as a good and hearty average that is in the pre-application guidance.
Looks like, as you were talking, Lauren, I looked that up in the pre-app guidance. 3,500 is the recommended estimate for that.
Thank you.
All right, let's see. From Victoria, can the scope of the project or project budget be changed during the full application, given the feedback received for the pre-application?
Yes, please. So yes.
Great.
Budget, work plan, especially based on feedback, can be changed based on updated reflections on plans, based on updating permitting pieces. All of those things can change your work plan and your budget. We've had folks before who realized, like, once they started to get into the wetlands permitting quotes, they're like, actually, we just like to reroute the trail around the wetland because that will save us so much money overall. So if you have a reason that you can say, yes, we're going to do that, as long as it's substantively the same project, you are welcome to make those updates.
And from
I have a
Eileen.
oh,
Yep.
sorry.
Go ahead.
I have a follow-up question to that. Tori and I are kind of working together on this, so I'm going to jump on board here. So it's a unique project in that we have 8 different locations for bike racks. So would it be possible, or what are your thoughts on altering the actual location of the bike rack based on that feedback? So changing
If
the
you could reach out to
location.
talk to us one-to-one with that would be a
Okay.
piece to maybe say, because like where like how many are you moving, how far are you moving them, what's
Okay.
the plan, please, because that's a really special circumstance that we want to
Okay.
review. It's one of those case by case. Please reach out, and like
Yes.
we'd love to
Okay.
talk with you more, because the answer may be yes, but we
Okay.
just have to review those details.
Okay, sure. So I will email you. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Sorry for
No,
interrupting.
please, this is perfect. And I guess
Okay.
I'll just say this for everybody. With the beginning of the pre-application phase, we didn't have capacity to be able to talk with folks one-to-one. We just didn't have that capacity, knowing the grants were coming in. We do know how many folks are in here now. And so we do have some opportunity to do quick calls if it needs to happen. Email is still the first best option because we can often get those out fast. But if there's something like this is nuanced and complex, we will be setting up with meetings with folks if need be. So just reach out to us if you have a question.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
So yeah, no, thank you for that.
Great. Thank you. We have a question from Eileen. Is there a limit to one award per town, i.e., example, municipality and a nonprofit?
We do not have a defined limit, but one of the priorities of the program, like one of the core pieces in terms of our selection, is going to be to fully consider the distribution of projects, and that includes geographic distribution. And so that's not to say that we won't fund 2 projects in the same town, but that's going to be a really intentional decision if we do, because the goal is to spread the funding across the state. So we have been tracking and mapping where projects go in the past. That is one piece, but like we definitely want to make sure that we're not awarding like all the money and all the support in only one community when this is meant to be a statewide project and statewide program. So it's not to say no, but it is to say it would be a very careful decision if we say yes.
So I do want to circle back to a comment that Cheryl made, perhaps a follow-up to a previous question that was
Yes.
answered. So let me just read that out to you. Since the project is being developed on land owned by the state, VTrans, that is being leased by the town, is a copy of the lease agreement between the state and the town, as well as a copy of an MOU executed between EHNO and the town, sufficient to meet the requirement of a letter of support from the agency, as required on page 19 of the application guidance.
Yeah, both of those documents are great to have and good requirements. With VTrans in particular, we do say this at some point in the application guidance, if it is a VTrans rail trail. We have talked with the rail trail staff, like your MOU is great. You should also reach out to Jackie Casino for a letter. So just to be able to say like the MOU is one part, but you should get a letter of support from Jackie Casino or another VTrans staff as related to that. So if it is a rail trail that is being managed by VTrans, that additional letter is really recommended.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, with these questions, I think we've gone through the ones in the chat.
We just
Oh,
got a new one from John. Quickly, was the geographic distribution considered in the pre-application to full application invitation process?
it was not. We did not look at that piece as one of our review criteria. So with the pre-application, everybody who was invited to move forward really passed the criteria that were outlined in the pre-application guidance for readiness, feasibility, eligibility, and compliance. Not every project that got submitted was invited to move forward. We found projects that were not eligible for RTP funding. And so we declined them at that point because there's no way the Federal Highway Administration would fund them and to save them the effort of going through a full application. So that was a piece there. But beyond that, we didn't consider any of the other factors that I described that we're going to be looking at for the full application in that initial review.
Right, I think that concludes questions in the chat for now, Lauren. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions that folks want to ask live that you'd like to come off mute and ask?
I have a question. It's actually not for me. It's from Irene Nagel, who is not able to be on the chat today. And it's I thought I put it in the chat, but if I didn't, so let me read it to you. She says, in our preliminary budget, the project costs are estimated at $71,506. Since the RTP grant is capped at $50,000, this means our match, which includes in-kind labor, comes in at 30%, well above the minimum match requirement of 20%. The costs of the project were estimated, but if project costs can be reduced, like through the use of town personnel and equipment and that kind of thing, the match might come in at less than 30%. Would this be permissible, and provided that at least a 20% match is maintained?
Yes, is the
Okay.
short answer. Yes. So you do have to maintain a 20% match requirement. When we
Okay.
get to the grant agreement development phase, if you have more than a 20% match requirement, if that's what we land on, that is what you will be accountable to. So if there's questions that come up of like, well, we thought it was going to be 30, but now it's going to be 27, like the grant agreement development phase is the phase where we need to work that out. Because once it's in the grant agreement, that's what you're going to be kind of held to as a piece. And so it can be more than 20. We have projects where sometimes we have 50-50 match. And if you've got that, great. We can move forward with that. But it can flex a little bit, but generally it's like once it hits that grant agreement development phase, that's when it's final, because we'll actually write that into the grant agreement as like, what is the required match?
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Are there any other questions? Well, I know this was go ahead, Tom. Oh, and you're muted, but hello.
Hi there. Thanks, Lauren. For the certificate of insurance, who are we naming as the insured?
It will be the state of Vermont. If you go to the section in the guidance, we actually have a full like document that we send to grant applicants about like what does it need to be, including like which boxes need to be checked.
Okay.
But you only need that certificate of insurance like if you're selected and move forward. So
got
you
it.
don't
All
need
right.
to get that now. It's only if
Okay.
you're selected to move forward.
Okay, great. Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, but it's like there's a state of Vermont the state of Vermont and its employees and blah blah blah. There's a line,
Yeah.
and you can just copy the line. Many of
Okay.
the insurance providers like, oh, it's this one again, and they know.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, with that, I know that there will be other questions that come up later. Please feel free to reach out to us at any point through email. So there are 3 folks who are actually all here on the call today who respond to emails in that shared inbox. It's myself, Marlena Baker, and Joe Kill, who are on our grants team. So you might hear back from any one of the 3 of us. But please feel free to reach out. And otherwise, we wish you all the best as you dig into preparing your applications. So I hope everyone has a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.